I'm going to start by where do you think I should be pointing? This direction? Cool. So I'm going to start by dealing with the question that I get most often from my students when I'm teaching for the first time, which is, why do I talk like this? And that's because I'm from this place. I grew up in London in the UK, and then I studied up in Edinburgh at the University of Edinburgh. And back then, as an undergrad, I got really interested in animal behavior, and I was working on it in these wasps. These are parasitoid wasps. And then I kind of moved away from insects. And for my PhD, I moved a bit further north up to the University of St. Andrews. That some people might know that's the birthplace of golf. It's where golf was invented. But I was working on these birds, these southern-masked weaver birds in Botswana, I'm trying to understand how they know how to build the nests that they do, and also working with zebra finches in the lab. And then I moved from Scotland to Tucson, Arizona, and that was partly just a response to the rain. After having lived in the rain for six years, I was like, I need to be somewhere sunny. And so I was looking at a globe and I was like, this place seems kind of sunny. And so, yeah, I did a postdoc, and this is when I first started working with bumblebees. And this is when I kind of fell in love with them as an animal to work with. This was 13 years ago now. And so I moved then from Tucson, Arizona to Reno, Nevada. I was at the University of Nevada, Reno, working with Annie Leonard for 6 or 7 years. And that's when I started working in the field out in the West, both in Nevada and in California. And I really fell in love with working with bumblebees in the wild. And I then took a professor job at UT Austin, where I worked for 5 years, and then just a year ago moved to UC Davis. And so my lab is currently split across these 2 locations. Okay. And so in addition to being a scientist, I've also been a science communicator for a really long time. When I was a grad student, I started writing a blog, and this was actually really early days of internet blogging. I remember when it was really only the true nerds who were doing it. Nowadays, I feel like there are some cool people writing blogs. But I got picked up by Scientific American. I worked for them for a number of years writing a blog. I've been on Science Friday a couple times. I've been, well, no, Science Friday once. I've been on NPR a couple times. And I've written various kind of popular science articles throughout the years, as well as generally just enjoying getting involved in outreach activities. So I work on cognition. And cognition is, this is a word that we use in the English language. We kind of use it in a certain way, but within the fields of animal behavior, what we really mean by cognition is how animals perceive their worlds, how they process that information, and how they make decisions based on that information. So basically everything that's kind of happening in their brain. And this isn't something that we can see directly. We have to get at it through carefully designed behavioral experiments. Because, right, like animals, wouldn't it be great if animals could talk and we could just ask them, like, what are you thinking? But since they can't, we have to try and get at what they're thinking through these carefully designed experiments. And in terms of, like, sometimes, I don't know, you might hear people say something like, does that animal even have cognition? From my perspective, every animal has cognition. It's just, what kind of cognition do they have? And that's what we're trying to understand, is like, what are they thinking? How are they thinking? And so for bumblebees, they perceive all kinds of different flower cues, like the scents, the colors, right? Like flowers look very pretty for us, but they're not designed for us, right? They have been designed by natural selection for bees and other pollinators. So they're these, somebody described them as sensory billboards. They're kind of overwhelming bees with information. And bees like bumblebees, they don't just visit one type of flower. Like many bees are specialists where they just visit like sunflowers, for example, whereas bumblebees visit many different types of flower. And these flowers, they vary in how good they are. And so bees have to like rapidly learn which of these flowers are the best. And then you can imagine if you're a bee and you're, in an environment like this, there are all these options. And this is just like one moment in time, right? This is going to change over time. And so they have to be updating this information all the time and making fairly complex decisions. And people have been working on bee behavior and cognition for a really long time. So Carl von Frisch is one of the kind of famous people because he won the Nobel Prize for his work on honeybees. He demonstrated that honeybees have got this waggle dance. So this bee here is dancing. And this is kind of a basic form of language. Through this dance that the other bees perceive, this is all done in the dark. They're doing it through touch. The bee demonstrates like where it has found food. And so the direction that it's dancing is the direction of the food. The number of times it like squiggles is how far away the food is. And how vigorous it's dancing is how good quality that food is. And so they can flexibly portray like any possible location out there. So it's a very flexible form of language. And he demonstrated this, won the Nobel Prize for it, but he also did work demonstrating learning abilities in honeybees. And so honeybees are one species, right? Bumblebees, there are many species of bumblebees. But I'd say kind of in the last 10 years or so, bumblebees have been featured a lot, both in scientific work and in the media, for all kinds of cool and complex abilities they have. So you might have seen some of these kind of things in the news about how smart bumblebees are. This was on NPR. Bees understanding the concept of zero. This was in honeybees, but it's also been shown in bumblebees that they can do basic forms of counting. A recent study on bumblebees playing. And this idea that, right, ultimately we are all animals and we all have neurons, and some of the ways that bees make decisions are similar to some of the ways that we make decisions. And some of the ways are very different. Like, for example, it turns out that while they count in a very different way to how humans count. But this is all stuff we're interested in. And so part of the reason people work with bumblebees is that they're highly trainable. So this is not one of my studies, but a study that was done where they trained bumblebees to push this red flap to get to this sugar reward that the bee is drinking. And so, right, this is like not something a bee would encounter in its environment, but they're so trainable. As long as you're giving them a sugar reward, you can get them to do just about anything. So here is a bumblebee pulling at some string to get at a sugar reward. And so, right, this is very impressive. And part of the reason the bumblebee can do this is because the researchers train them in a stepwise fashion. So just like if you were training your dog to do a trick, you would start off with something really, really simple and then make it more complex. That's exactly how these scientists train the bee to do that. But right, like why do bumblebees even do this, right? Why can we bring them into a lab and they will do all these fun tricks for us? And I should say, right, the reason that these scientists were doing this is to ask questions about their cognition in a setting that is not designed to be a natural setting. But if we look at bees on their natural flowers, they have to manipulate all these different complex morphologies of flowers to get into the rewards. They have to deal with all these different cues. And so bumblebees, they're very flexible in their use of different cues. And so, from a bee's perspective, it could be manipulating something like this, or it could be manipulating a piece of card in a lab. And from its perspective, all of these things are just, weird flowers to try and get the rewards from. Okay, and so a bumblebee is going to have a particular type of cognition based on what it needs to do in its environment. But of course, all these different animals have got different forms of cognition. And, I think like traditionally, and maybe even kind of a lot of how people think today, often we like to think that we're kind of at the pinnacle of cognition, that humans are like the smartest species, and every species is just a lesser version of humans. But within the field of cognition and ecology and evolution, that's not how we think about these animals, right? It's all these animals have evolved to deal with the environments that they have to deal with, and they all have different skills that they're particularly good at. And so, for example, this chickadee that I'm sure a lot of you know, this mountain chickadee, actually, I'm going to shame myself as not a bird person. I'm pretty sure this is a mountain chickadee. I've got a photo. Okay. You know, they cache seeds throughout the winter, and they can remember thousands of spatial locations. And so if we were judging kind of intelligence in terms of how well you can remember things, these guys would be smarter than me because I am like consistently losing my keys. Right? But if we were thinking about like learning about different scents, then the bees would be better than me because they can smell better than I can. But you know, as humans, when we think about intelligence, we kind of pick the traits that we know we're good at, right? Like language and face recognition and things that we think are important because they're important to us. But there are all these other amazing abilities out there that these animals use for what they need to do in their environments. And so, you know, there are all these different species, but even just within bees, there are so many different species of bee. And in North America, we have 4,000 species of bee, roughly. In the world, there are 20,000 species of bee. And so, right, well, we tend to fixate on the honeybee and the bumblebee. There are all these other species. And these species, they're going to vary in how they think about their worlds. And we just know so little about the vast majority. Nearly everything we know comes from honeybees and bumblebees. And even just within bumblebees, there are 250 species worldwide, 50 species in North America. Here are some local ones, some ones that I work with near this area. And if we zoom in even further, we might think of bumblebees as all kind of the same. But actually, even within a single colony of bumblebees, there are individuals with really different roles. And so most people, when you think of a bumblebee, you're going to think, okay, there's a colony established. This is in the summer. We see lots of bumblebees out visiting flowers. But there's this whole other side to the bumblebee colony life cycle. At the end of the colony, they produce multiple queens that leave the colony. They mate, they overwinter. And then in the spring, some of you might have seen this, these absolutely massive bumblebees are out and about. And so the queens, when they're out foraging, they don't yet have a colony. It's just them. And so you might expect, right, that all the pressure is on this one individual to learn and remember and make good decisions and not mess up. And so this is something that I got interested in. And so I did an experiment where I was collecting these bumblebees. This is the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesensky. I was working in the Reno Desert and then also Dog Valley Meadow, which is kind of on the border of California and Nevada. And, you know, so then, yeah, this is a method that I use. Like when I catch wild bees, I'll put them in a tube and we can train bees really, really quickly. And so we can give bees like strips of colored paper where, for example, in that case, the blue strip was rewarding. The yellow strip just has water on it that bees don't like. And then you can basically catch a bee, put it in a tube and train it to learn like yellow is good, blue is bad, and then release the bee again. And the bee can learn in like 30 minutes. It happens really quickly. And so we can measure their learning. I can catch wild bees, measure their learning, and then tag them and release them again. Okay. And so, yeah, so I did this experiment where I compared queens and workers in terms of their learning, because I was thinking that the queens would be particularly good at learning these associations. And I make it sound like this experiment was really like well planned out. The reality is that, you know, I had just started as an assistant professor in 2019. And I remember that first semester, I was like teaching for the first time. I was managing budgets for the first time. Everything was kind of crazy. And at the end of that semester, I was like, man, everything has been really hard, but at least it can only get better from this point onwards. And so in spring 2020, I was visiting some friends back in Reno for what I thought was going to be a 3-day visit. And then the planes were canceled, the university closed, and I ended up spending 6 months back in Reno. And so I basically grabbed a bunch of lab supplies from my old lab. I set up a little home lab in this basement. where I was locked down. And I did some really simple behavioral experiments. Once the weather got a bit better, I took my home lab outdoors. And this gave me a chance just to see where the queens were, to like spend some time outdoors observing them, which we kind of rarely have the privilege of doing and kind of the hustle and bustle of day-to-day life. And basically, I found that, as I expected, these queen bumblebees were better at learning than the worker bumblebees were. And so this kind of basic finding has now formed the basis of a grant I have from the National Geographic. So they have this program called the Wildlife Intelligence Project that's specifically designed for us to understand cognition in wild animals. And so it was inspired by Jane Goodall and all the work she did, understanding, cognition in primates. And now there are 3 of us who are funded on this, somebody working on tool use in monkeys, somebody working on dolphin-human relationships, and then me working on bumblebees. And so now with this grant, we're basically trying to understand queen cognition better, like what is going on with the queens. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been up to this last year. And so, okay, it seemed like the queens were better at learning about these color learning. The next question I had was, is this something specific to color, or are they better at learning in general? And then my other question was, okay, like if you see in this video here, this is a queen above, this is a worker below. The queens are much bigger than the workers, right? They have bigger eyes, bigger antennae. They're going to be better at seeing, better at smelling. And so some of this learning, what I think is learning, might actually be just driven by the fact that they can see better and smell better, right? So for example, if I take like a husky and I train it to learn an odor association, it might learn it way faster than I do. And that's not because it's necessarily better at learning, it's just it's better at smelling than I am. And so trying to separate out these kind of what is driving these effects. And so I did this experiment last summer where I caught a bumblebee, and this bee is being given a particular scent on one strip, and then she's getting a sugar reward on the other strip. And so she's learning this scent is rewarding. And then I give her a second scent, and then I give her water. And so she smells that second scent, she tastes that water, she's like, nope, I don't like that. And so after a few of these, she learns really quickly. I then give her a test. And in the test, I just give her the 2 different scents. And we can see that she sticks her tongue out. And that shows me, okay, which one of these 2 scents is she choosing? And so it's a really nice kind of simple way we can measure learning. And so through this experiment, I found that the queens were also better at learning about the scents. So it seems like they're more generally better at learning than workers. And while they were better at detecting those scents, that wasn't what was driving their learning performance. So now I feel like very confident that there is actually something about their learning per se that is better in queens. Okay, and so one experiment that we did this last summer, this is led by my postdoc, Sarah, and this was work, Sarah, while she was working at Seichen, which is just north of Truckee, it's a field station, and my postdocs were staying at the TERC field house this summer, which was a wonderful experience for them. It seems like the queens are better at learning than workers, but we also are wondering, when queens and workers are visiting flowers like this, are they making different decisions of which flowers to visit? And so when bees visit flowers in a meadow, they make decisions of whether these flowers are good or bad based on their comparison to other flowers. And so we call this comparative decision making. This is something that many animals like us do, right? We don't often think like, for example, is my salary like enough for like me to live on? Does this seem like a objectively good salary, right? Instead, what we do is we compare ourselves to other people. We compare ourselves to like the last salary we got. And so most of the time as humans, our decision making is made comparatively. And so the same is true of bees. When they're visiting these different flowers, they're making these decisions comparatively. And one of the things that kind of emerges from that is this process called negative incentive contrast. And again, this is something that shows up in humans as well. For bees, if they're visiting a flower and it's got, say, 15% sucrose sugar, they think this is great. They're very happy visiting this flower. They then visit a flower that is even better, and they think this is amazing, this 50% sugar. And now when they try that 15% again, they now think this is terrible. And they were happy drinking this just like minutes ago. But now in comparison to something they've just had, they're like, this is disgusting. Why would you offend me by presenting me with this horrible, horrible stuff? Right? And this is a process, right, that, of course, you know, I'm sure you can think of many examples with humans that are equivalent. Okay. And so to test this, we caught some wild bees, we put them in these little tubes. And I should say that the bees are, one of the great things about bumblebees is that they're really happy to partake in these kinds of experiments. After I mark them and release them, I will have them flying back and trying to squash themselves back into my tubes because they're like, this is the best flower I've ever visited in my life. But here, yeah, we train them to stick their head through this little hole and drink sucrose out of the well. And it was a really simple experiment. We were just asking, do you want to drink this or do you not want to drink this? And so this is what this looks like. Here is a video of a bumblebee when it's happily accepting sucrose. So yeah, you can see she's really motivated to get every last bit of that. In contrast, when they don't like it, yeah, so you can see like her tongue, you know, she's tasting it, but she's like, nope, I don't want to drink that. So it's a really clear, easy behavior for us to see. And so what we found is that the queens actually had less of this incentive contrast effect than the workers. So the workers, we see this really strong rejection, and that's something that's been shown before. But with the queens, they're much happier to drink that lower quality sucrose after they've had the higher quality one. And what we think is going on there is that for a queen, you know, it's just you, right? You're visiting these different flowers, and you probably know that this isn't as good as what you've just had, but you just don't want to take that risk of rejecting it and moving on, right? It's like, this is still okay, perfectly good sucrose, even if it's not as good as what you've just had, I'm not going to take that risk. Whereas workers, they have that whole colony structure and they can afford to take that risk because they're essentially not working alone. They're working as part of a team. And so they can kind of afford to take these risks. Okay. And so, you know, one thing that we want to do this year is kind of take that basic finding and see how it plays out when bumblebees are actually foraging between flowers in a more kind of realistic setup. Because, you know, one possible implication of this is that queens and workers, right, they're visiting, this is a video taken at Van Norden Meadow. They're visiting these flowers at different times of year. They're deciding which flowers are they going to drink nectar from. And if queens and workers have got different decision-making strategies, you know, this has implications for them, but it also has implications for the flowers that they visit. Because as I mentioned earlier, these flowers, right, the reason they are the way they are is because of the bees that visit them. They have selective pressures from these bees. Okay. So for the next part of this talk, I'm going to totally switch gears. And instead of talking about science, I'm going to talk a bit about science communication. If you ask most people to think of a bee, I'm not going to ask you guys to do this because I feel like I have primed you way too heavily to think about bumblebees right now. But right, if you ask most people to think of a bee, what bee are they going to think of? Yes, of course, a honeybee, our European honeybee. And these bees, right, the reason that we think of them is because they're one that humans have this like long history with. We domesticated them a long time ago, even our agriculture. but they're not native to North America, right? They were brought over by European colonists. They compete with our native bees. And people often have no idea about all these other bees that are out there. And if you didn't know about them, like, no shame. I didn't know about them before I started working with bees. You know, there are these, you know, amazing giant carpenter bees. There are all these teeny tiny bees that often, right, people, you would look at them and you think that's a fly or that's a wasp. But all the, and actually the closest relative of this carpenter bee is this bee here. And so, yeah, and so if anybody's interested in this, there's this wonderful book called Bees in Your Backyard. It's got great photos of all these bees to try and identify some of the bees out there. Like in this region, we have so many different cool native bees with all these cool histories. And of course, I'm sure it's not news to you all that a lot of these bees are threatened. We have massive insect declines more generally and massive declines in bees. And I think that, you know, people care about them, but often the efforts are put towards honeybees. You know, and as bee scientists, this is kind of our like chip on our shoulder, where whenever, you know, you see kind of campaigns like Save the Bees, they put on these honeybees, and actually honeybees aren't in trouble. Honeybees are doing fine. We domesticate them, we breed them. In North America, there are plenty of honeybees, right? Every so often there are honeybee losses because of intensive farming practices. And if we have honeybee losses, it's not good for agriculture, but the ecosystems are not going to collapse, right? It's the loss of these native bees that is what really matters in terms of kind of the longevity of this planet. And so it's not to kind of shame people. I think that, right, people are excited and want to help, but then there's so much misinformation out there about which bees we should be helping. And it's not to say that people haven't publicized this. So, you know, I did some searching. These are kind of big news outlets covering this fact. You know, America's 4,000 native bees need a day in the sun. The best way to help bees, don't become a beekeeper. What we got wrong about saving the bees, right? This is a topic that is covered, and yet I would say hasn't infiltrated the public consciousness, right? Even just like scientists I meet at UC Davis would have no idea about this. This is like not common knowledge, I would say. And so for me, you know, I spend my days playing with bumblebees. This makes me very happy. This is what gets me up in the morning. But it's really hard for me to do my research day to day while I'm reading all these articles about bee declines, pollinator declines, plummeting insect numbers threaten the collapse of nature. And I start to feel a little bit like the dog in this meme, where I just want to play with my bumblebees, and meanwhile the world is on fire. And so kind of having this feeling and, you know, the knowledge of what is happening to the bees, the fact that we're losing all these species and people don't even know about the species that we're losing. And then the people who do care, like often the efforts can be misguided, led me to think that if I could just write a children's book to teach kids that there's more than one type of bee out there, that this might have like a bigger impact than all of my science career combined. And so I wrote this book called Am I Even a Bee? And it was illustrated by Alexa Lindauer. She was a master's student at the time at University of Nevada, Reno, and also had an art degree. And she had done scientific illustration in the past. And so it was like this wonderful partnership. And we were published by Baobab Press. They're the publishing branch. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Sundance Books in Reno, which is sadly now closed. But they still have the publishing branch, and they published us while I was living in Reno. And I'm not going to read you the whole book, but I'm going to give you kind of the cliff notes. So the book is about this bee called Osmia. And when she was born, her mother, she laid this egg in this bed of pollen, and she said, she left her a note saying, "You are a bee." But now Osmia is all grown up. Here she is in the bottom corner here. And she sees all these other bees, like bees on magazines, bees on people's t-shirts, bees on telly. And all these bees kind of look the same. And she's like, this is weird because I don't look like any of these bees. And there are all these other insects too, like flies and moths and beetles. And those bees also look like these other bees. And those other bees, they're really social. They're always having these parties and hanging out together. But she lives alone in this hole. And those bees, they're round and fluffy and yellow and black, whereas she is slender, her hair is patchy, she's this blue-green color. And so at first she tries to blend in. She tries to look like some of those other bees. She tries to paint herself. She tries to stick on birds' feathers to make herself look fluffier, but it doesn't really work. And so she's feeling kind of dejected and starts to basically have this identity crisis about whether she is a bee at all. And so then she flies into this carpenter bee, and the carpenter bee is like, what's up? And she's like, I'm having this identity crisis. And the carpenter bee is like, well, you know, they call me a carpenter bee, but actually I'm really bad at building stuff. And so maybe you shouldn't worry so much about other people's labels. And why don't you come with me and meet some of the bees in our meadow? And so the carpenter bee introduces her to the sweat bee that drinks cow's tears, true fact, these digger bees, and this parasitic bee nomada that parasitizes other bees. And again, these in real life, these parasitic bees, they don't have any of their own fuzz because they don't have to collect their own pollen because they just parasitize other bees. And so then at the end of the book, Osmia sings this song to celebrate that there are many ways to be a bee. Okay, and so one thing we did when we were writing this book is we tried really hard to make the characters in the book look like the actual bees. And so here what we have is the pictures from the book on the left and actual photos of the bees on the right. And the goal being that kids would read the book and then be able to identify bees in their natural environment based on this. And so we did the book launch at Sundance in 2022. And since then, we've been doing all kinds of outreach events at bookshops and libraries and schools. And my lab has been really helpful in helping with all of this. And what we've been doing is I often read the book, and this then essentially serves as an anchor text where kids can then, you know, they have those bees in their mind and they're somewhat meaningful to them. And then we can show them the actual bees, and kids are, you know, more excited, I think, than they would have been otherwise. And we also bring live bees and teach them all about native bees. And what's been really exciting is that other nonprofits, this is a nonprofit in Oregon, have also been using the book for a similar purpose. And then just recently, the illustrator and I we were lucky enough to be given an award down in South Lake Tahoe, this Gift of Literacy event, where we spoke to all the first graders in the South Lake Tahoe School District about the book and about native bees. And then also just to say that I've received a lot of like really nice emails and comments online from teachers and librarians and people who are using the book in the way that I would have hoped, which is to then teach kids more about bees. And so because it seems like there's a desire for this, what I'm doing right now is I'm working in collaboration with the Xerces Society, which is kind of the largest pollinator nonprofit in North America. Colleen Carr, who maybe some people here know, she's a teacher at Tahoe Expedition Academy and National Geographic, as well as the illustrator who illustrated the book. And we're making materials for teachers to then go with the book, to teach kids about native pollinators, but incorporating the characters from the book through the illustrations. And so just to say that, you know, this feeling that I think like all of us have in different ways, right? Of like the world being on fire and just how do we kind of continue with the day-to-day? I think for me, like picking one thing that is something I care about and was something that was in the realm of possibility for me to actually act on, being able to teach kids that there's more than one type of bee out there has been a really like personally rewarding in terms of combating that feeling. And so I will just finish by thanking my lab, UC Davis and UT Austin, my collaborators, my funding, TERC for inviting me here. And I also just wanted to finish by saying that at UC Davis, I'm part of the Animal Behavior Graduate Group. And so this is a group of people who work on animal behavior in all its different forms. We've got people working on domestic species, like cows. We have people working on like more native species, exotic species, studying behavior from all different angles. And like, you know, many kind of programs right now, we are dealing with massive budget cuts from the state. And so just to kind of finish with like a little plug for our group, who recently got essentially a GoFundMe. So if any of this stuff has kind of sparked your interest and you would like to support more behavior research, that's something, you know, I'd appreciate. And so with that, I have, I think, time for questions. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So not as much as you might think. When I was working with bees, like every single day, I would say I averaged once every 6 months, which sounds good, but is actually bad. Because if you're a beekeeper and you get stung every single day, you're much less likely to develop an allergy. If you get stung intermittently, it gives your body more of a chance to like ramp up a response. And it's kind of amazing how many bee scientists are allergic to bees because of that. Yeah.
Back at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about, is the queen a quicker learner than a working bee? You were given 2 strips of paper.
Yeah.
And the thing that came into my mind was, you know how there are a lot of human males that are colorblind?
Yeah.
How did you know?
That's a really, no, that's a really, really good question. So, right, as humans, we have 3 photoreceptor cones that determine like what colors we can see. Bumblebees also have 3, but they are shifted to lower wavelengths, which basically means they can see in the UV part of the spectrum. So like many flowers that to us look white actually have all kinds of crazy patterns that bees can see, but they can't see so well in the red part of the spectrum. And so, for example, when we're working with bees and we don't want them to like fly at us, we turn off the lights and put on red light because then we have the advantage and we can see better than them. But we have a machine called a spectrophotometer. And so anytime we work with color, we measure that the color in the spectrophotometer. And then somebody else, thank God, has worked out all the sensitivities of their photoreceptors. And I can run a model that then tells me how do the bees see these colors, which is really handy because then I can say, okay, the bee sees these colors as really similar or really different. So we know that we're, yeah, not giving them something that's like a colorblind task. So that's a really good question. Yeah.
I had a couple of questions, but the first one was when the bee is getting the nectar, is that only for their own consumption or are they bringing that back to the hive?
Yeah, so for the workers, they are getting some for their own themselves, but mostly they are collecting for the colony.
Then they hold the nectar?
Yeah, they have this like little crop, and then when they get back to the colony, there are honey pots. They regurgitate it into the honey pots, and that's what honey is. And so honey is basically just like regurgitated nectar mixed with bee gut enzymes, is essentially, yeah. Sorry to ruin honey for everybody.
And so when you look at like the sugar reward, that seems like something that's like relatively easy design, but then to study like how much pollen the flower has and when they're making pollen versus the nectar, is it kind of like a relationship where the more nectar, the more pollen typically?
No, and that's another really good question. So actually, so many I've like a lot for many years I worked just on pollen, and I loved working on pollen. I think it's an area that is really understudied, and I think the reason it's understudied is because you get horribly allergic to the pollen that you work with, right? And like nobody wants to be handling handfuls of pollen every day. Like that's a terrible idea. And so yeah, so pollen and nectar have got this amazing chemical complexity. And so, yeah, we simplify nectar often to sucrose, but it has like all these different chemicals. And so, for example, citrus nectar has got caffeine in it. And when bees visit citrus flowers, they will remember those flowers better because the caffeine boosts their memories. And from the plant perspective, this is potentially a way that a plant can trick a bee into coming back to it, even though its reward might not be amazing, right? But it's giving this little caffeine dose. And so I have done some experiments thinking more about the nectar chemistry. I have done experiments thinking about pollen. With the pollen, it's like this whole other ballgame, because it's like, it's this crazy reward where there are all these different chemical components to it. It is very chemically defended because, right, it's where plants, it's where their sex cells are. It's the most expensive part, the most like precious thing. So they have all these ways to stop animals stealing it, because it's also a really protein-rich source, and all kinds of herbivore insects want to eat that pollen. So it's very defended. And so, you know, bees have evolved like tolerances to those defenses, but also have all kinds of, yeah, cool tricks to kind of process it. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, I read somewhere, and I can't remember what it would be, but they could see other wavelengths of light, like infrared. Can bees see infrared?
Infrared, I don't think so. Oh, Ava says yes. Ava Fisher, another professor from UC Davis.
And is it some kind of fungus that gets them, or is
With the honeybees, it seems like it's a combination of things that has like caused many colonies to die. There are these mites that have been getting in. There are viruses. There's like other kinds of disease. I mean, part of the problem is that it's essentially like an intensive farming. You know, we take these bees by the millions and millions, put them onto like almond orchards, and then when the almond season is done, we kind of ship them off somewhere else. All of that process is really stressful for them. Obviously, they would never normally be kind of shipped around like this or bred in these intensive ways. So they're often really stressed out and kind of have low immune systems before we then like throw all these other issues at them, right? And the intensive farming and the high densities and everything, also there's more like virus spread and more. And so I'd say that like the problem is, as always, is like us and how we're doing things. Yeah. Yes.
So in honeybees, the queen is kind of stationary in the hive. It seems like these queens are much more out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how many different colony types have the queen staying home, so to speak?
Yeah, so honeybees, there are a few species of honeybee. There's kind of the one that we all think of, but then honeybees originated in Asia, and there are a few different honeybee species in Asia. I'm not sure about the other honeybees, but the one that we all think of, the kind of European honeybee, the queen does stay in the hive for all of its life, except for when it does a mating flight. But bumblebee queens, yeah, really different in that they have this whole part of their life cycle, and they can be out for months and months alone in this way. So it's very different, yeah, from the honeybees. Within bumblebee species, most bumblebees have a life cycle like this, with the exception of these really cool bumblebees that are parasitic bumblebees. And so these bumblebees, they don't have their own colony. They just go into another bumblebee species colony, kill their queen, take control of the workers, and then they lay their eggs, which develop directly into new parasitic queens, and the workers of the other species will rear their babies. And so totally, yeah, different strategy. Like they're called cuckoo bumblebees, like cuckoo birds, and there's a few different species. And interestingly, there are some species that can kind of decide whether they want to parasitize or not, depending on like the environment. Exactly. Yeah. No, there are other cuckoo, like so many bees are parasitic actually, because parasitism is actually like a very good strategy to evolve, right? You don't have to go out and find the food yourself if you can just steal it from another animal. And so it's something that has evolved again and again.
Are they furry like the other one?
The bumblebee queens that are parasitic are still fuzzy, but what is cool, when you look at them under a microscope, their faces look very intense. Like they have this whole, like, it's like a shield of a face. And apparently, again, I'm not sure about this, somebody told me that it's because when they go into other bumblebees colonies, they often get stung a ton. And so they have this like thick face to deal with being like stung in the face. Yeah. Yeah, and so we have a ton of bee diversity in this part of the world. Kind of more generally, I'd say across, there are tons of bees in the tropics, but to generalize, while there are many, like for most animals, there's greater diversity in the tropics. For bees, there is greater diversity in the deserts. And so through kind of California, Nevada, Utah, we have some of the greatest bee diversity in the world. And so, yeah, I think that, I don't know, when I'm out, like at Sagehen, for example, I'm often have my bumblebee vision on, but I do see all these other species. Some of them are really tiny. Obviously, the carpenter bees are much bigger. People often get them confused with bumblebees, but the carpenter bees are much shinier than the bumblebees. And so, yeah, there is a ton of bee diversity here. Yeah. We just, it's very simple. We just put a little dot of paint on their back, and that's basically so that I don't catch the same bee twice. But they're totally fine with it, and yeah. Yes.
I haven't heard much about the African killer bees. What's going on?
Well, yeah, so, I think, okay, African killer bees does sound really bad. So this was a strain that I think originated in Brazil. And so the African part, I think, is actually a misnomer. Maybe like one part of the, like, honeybees have so many strains because of the history of their breeding, but the one that moved into North America moved up through like the Americas, and it's in Arizona, and I think it's maybe in some other states, because it's much less cold tolerant, so it's basically in the warmer places. It's a more aggressive strain, and so that's why it's been called like killer bee. And people will tell you, yeah, that like if you disturb one of those colonies, those bees will mess you up in a way that European bees don't. I think the interesting thing is that, like, I was talking about how we've thrown all these stresses at the European bees and they're really, really struggling. I have seen videos of the Africanized strain where there are mites in their colony, and the European bees, like, they're getting covered in mites and they're like, this is terrible. The other strain, they just like rip those mites to pieces. And so in a way, I kind of think that, like, right, we throw all these problems at these bees, and yeah, they get replaced by a more resistant, a more aggressive strain. That's kind of what you might expect, right? It's either like die or fight back. And so in Arizona now, there are a bunch of beekeepers who know how to work with these bees and are specifically working with them because they're so much more resistant to all the issues that they're dealing with. Yes.
So if carpenter bees truly are not very good about building bookshelves, why are they called?
So yeah, they put holes in wood. They chew holes in wood for their nests, and so a lot of people think of them as like a pest. But yeah, they leaving like old, people often kind of want to tidy their gardens up, but often leaving a garden messy is the best thing you can do for bees, and also like a really nice excuse to just be lazy. You can be like, I'm doing it for the bees. And so leaving old bits of wood for bees to burrow into, if they have enough wood, they're not going to go into the house. Yeah, and I think they're wonderful bees. One thing about carpenter bees, if you see a carpenter bee visiting flowers, they have teeny tiny tongues. And so they can't visit flowers often, like through the normal flower petal entrance. And so instead what they do is they just puncture a hole in the back of the flower. It's called nectar robbing. And it's kind of the standard strategy for carpenter bees. Yes.
Do you have any comments about insect boats and habitat? That's something
Cool.
You know, ours.
Yeah, I have. I can't answer that question specifically because I don't have enough knowledge, but I have heard about yeah, highways being bad for killing insects as well as obviously other animals. You know, I think more broadly, right? I think, you know, if we take it's basically down to just mass urbanization, right? If we take meadows and turn them into parking lots, right? We've just obviously changed our environment in a way where bees can't survive. You know, I think often just the combination of having got rid of native habitat, along with the fact that like any of us can walk into Home Depot and buy chemicals that are banned in all of Europe for being known to kill bees, and we can spray these on anything in our garden, right? Just like the combination of the pesticides, the agriculture, the loss of habitat, yeah, roads are a part of that. We're kind of just hitting them with everything. Yes.
They decide which female.
Yeah, so that that's a good question. So with the honeybees, they're fed like this royal jelly, which is basically just a really high sugar concentration honey, which is always funny because sometimes I feel like in like health food stores, I'll see them selling royal jelly, and it's basically just like honey with more sugar is what it is. But it'll be going for like $30, you know. With the bumblebees, people actually aren't certain about what it is that causes the new queens. It seems like there's probably like a few different cues that are feeding into a different developmental trajectory, but it's not as clear cut as it is with the honeybees. Well, so most basically within a bumblebee colony, nearly all of them are female for most of the colony life. And then at the end of the colony life, they make these new queens, and then they produce males as well. And then the males and the queens, they like leave the colony, they mate with other queens and males. The males die, all the workers die, everyone dies for the winter except for the queens who bury down and hibernate throughout the winter. Yes.
So you mentioned that you're making teaching materials now for teachers, and I actually used to work at Linear Lab too, and I have been using your book to go around and teach other kids in elementary school and high school about how to tell life and wasps. I was wondering if there's a way I can subscribe to get that info when it's out.
Of course. Yeah, shoot me an email.
Okay.
One of the, when I was working, one of the things that I was in the barcode scanning system, and there was actually a study where they put little barcodes on the bees and scanned them as they came in and out of the hive.
Yeah, I have done this before as well. Yeah, it was like very time intensive. I'd say maybe not worth the effort. But it was interesting because it was a way of saying, like, having data being collected passively and being able to say, like, who is actually leaving and how often are they going? And I was surprised that it was actually kind of a few individuals who were doing most of the work. Yeah, of course. Yeah, one more question. Maybe a happy question rather than a sad, but yeah. The leafcutter bees.
It seems that roses are just fine until about a month ago.
Yeah. 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 So first of all, you're very lucky to have those leafcutter bees in your garden. Yeah, and so nearly all bees have got an annual life cycle where there's a particular time of year that they're like finding food, provisioning young, and then nearly all of them will die out for the winter, and it'll just be their offspring that kind of survive for the next round. Honeybees are really unusual in that they don't have that annual life cycle. And the reason that they don't is because when all the flowers are gone in the winter, they have this massive store of honey that they can rely on to get through that winter. And that's why we call them honeybees, and why we domesticated them as a species is because they were already making this massive store of honey. And so that was a long way of answering that, yeah. Cool, thank you. But I think no more questions, but I will hang out and I'm really happy to chat to people afterwards.
Thank you very much.